Hi, my name is Ruth Samalo. I'm one of the featured programmers for Doc NYC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Director Cecilia Aldorando for the Q&A of Landfall. We love you, Cecilia. You've been part of our festival family for a long time. How are you?
You know, I'm hanging in there, all things considered. I cannot complain. Yeah, I'm okay. How are you?
Good, thank you. Very happy to get the pleasure of hanging out with a lot of filmmakers from the comfort of my own house. This is it's working out for me, I have to say.
It's good.
But let's talk about your magnificent film that most people watching this Q&A have seen just now. Tell us a little bit about, because something that I love about it is how you do this very intricate weaving of what might even seem like disparate things, but you weave them like in a very kind of like quiet and poetic way. We've weaved them all together, like the hurricane of the heart of the people that are fighting, for the rights to take control of their destiny and to not be economically oppressed, from the people that are rebuilding their networks, their families, their infrastructures, to like this network of events that started with Christopher Columbus in the island, the deep seeping of colonialism reoccurring again. So it's like a little map of like how all these things are connected, but in a very delicate way, connecting everything. Tell us a little bit about, was this your idea when you started thinking about this film? Like, how did you envision or dream this film, and what were the phases that you went through to get to where the film is at?
Well, I think I would start with post-production actually, because I think the enormous credit should go to the film's editor, Tara Jean Long, who I worked with in a very close collaboration. The thing that I love about documentary is that you can sort of see the full circle of intention. It's like what I set out to make corresponds with what we ended up doing in post-production, but I like to reverse engineer it because a lot of what we struggled with and frankly, was really challenging was to achieve a kind of balance between, it was a pretty tall order, I think. But I think I would first say that, what I appreciate about working with Tara is that she is a very patient editor and a very impressionistic one. And so it really, I think, is hugely important for the tone of the film, that we really sought not to just explain what's going on in Puerto Rico, but to create a mood piece, an experience, an invitation that is emotional and maybe not just in here, but really a sort of a whole body, whole soul kind of experience. So what I will say is when I started making the film, I always wanted to make a film that, well, it was a number of different things, but one of them was, I always knew I wanted to make a film that was going to be holistic. And part of this, there were multiple reasons for this, but part of it is that I was very aware, for example, that outside of Puerto Rico, there is so little awareness and understanding of the, not just the crisis, but Puerto Rico as a whole and its history, that it felt important to make a film that was kind of a primer, as it were, that would say, okay, you might have heard of Hurricane Maria, but in fact, the situation in Puerto Rico is much more complex. So I knew that I wanted to achieve, and I knew that by, say, focusing on a couple of different protagonists or storylines, that would not do justice to the scope and the breadth of the situation. But it also was about a productive tension. I think prismatic films like this one, where you have kind of interwoven stories, you can start to see the way certain things connect that you might not otherwise. And so, I really wanted to show, for example, like how something like climate change comes up against something like debt or gentrification or like a land grab. It's like we think of these things in this very sort of abstracted way or maybe in an isolated way. And so it felt like a valuable thing to put these experiences into tension. And then the last thing I would say is, speaking back to the tone of the piece, I was, when I started the film, very concerned about the kind of cliche of disaster stories that was surrounding Puerto Rico at the time. You know, I think we can see this in Hurricane Katrina or similar kinds of disasters where it seemed to me that the media really only wanted to tell one kind of story about Puerto Rico, and it was one of tragedy and victimhood and people waiting for handouts. And there was a huge amount that was being missed in the way that Puerto Rico was being depicted. So anyway, that's a lot of different answers. I think I gave you like 5 answers to your question.
No, that was exactly right. That was what I was thinking. So thank you. But also you went about it in a very what I would say humble way, which is this is like to me a compliment, because you went to the particular people, you went to the human stories. And something that I really love is that you don't have any kind of like, you know, voiceover of God, not even yours. And, you know, you don't have experts, you don't have like, not even climate experts or, you know, activist experts or NGO people. You just have the people, you know, and I love how it starts even with you, with a conversation with one of your collaborators, I think, right? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about working with Lale, and these 2 women on the beach, just like, you know, in a quiet, beautiful night, you know, and just showing each other images on the phone about the protest that was incredible and achieved incredible results, but also that triggers a lot of memories of everything that happened before. So, and that's kind of like, you know, it becomes like a beautiful opening and ending of like where the intentions are, you know, this intention to be with somebody, to listen to somebody. And I think there's a lot of really important listening that we get to experience in the film because of the way that you constructed. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about working with Lale and those moments of listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I think that intimacy is a really underutilized strategy when we're talking about big issues in documentary film. I think that there's a sort of expectation that if you're making a film about a seismic disaster, then you have to have a certain kind of tone that is really, you know, like an action movie almost. And I feel like, particularly when you're talking about the unresolved grief that is really overwhelming, I think, in a place like Puerto Rico, it seemed to me really important to make a film that would hold space for listening, and for testimony. You know, there's a sort of theme throughout the film that people in Puerto Rico are sort of dissuaded from remembering, right? We're sort of told, don't go back, move forward. And so it's part of the task of the film to say, what do we lose if we don't go back? And so that's part of the invitation of the film. In terms of my collaboration with Lale, so for those that don't necessarily, we didn't make this explicit. The 2 people on the beach are me and Lale, who was my main collaborator on the film. And Lale is a Puerto Rico-based activist and DJ who has been very involved in the political situation there. And I am a Puerto Rican who grew up outside of Puerto Rico in the diaspora. And so when I started making the film, it was very, very clear to me, even though I felt my own grief and my own very intense feelings, and in many ways, my motivation was personal to make the film, I also was aware that my experience was not, and it was increasingly weird. Like as I made the film, I was like, oh, people who are living in Puerto Rico, who are surviving the crisis, who are, you know, in that everyday way, have a very different understanding than I do. And it felt incumbent upon me to situate myself as a listener to that. And so we kind of, you know, we both made it like not explicit, but also very explicit. You know, we never expected Lale to be in the film. And part of, you know, for those that, you know, don't know, there's the primary voiceover in the film is Lale's testimony. And that interview was a test interview. We actually did it. We wanted to do a bunch of audio interviews to invite people in Puerto Rico to reflect on their memories. And I did one as a test we were just getting to know one another in our collaboration. And
was this the first one where she talks about her cat being upset with her?
Yeah.
Oh.
And it was one of these things where Lale had not spoken with anyone in this intensive a way about the hurricane. And and this is one of the things that we became very aware of, is that a lot of people have been asked to kind of, you know, suppress those memories and move on. And so we were not expecting that it would be such an intense experience for Lale or for me. But then when we went to go edit, of all the interviews we had done, because we'd done a bunch of, following that conversation, a bunch of other interviews, Lale's was the most heartfelt and the most, it just happened that way. So it was kind of by accident, but it ended up becoming a kind of model for not only for how we made the film, but for the proposition of the film, right? It's saying, it's actually suggesting to you, if you went through this, if this is something that speaks to your personal experience, my hope is that this is a film that holds space for that experience, and that invites you with care to be seen and heard and acknowledged, and to hopefully heal from that. If you don't have direct experience of the hurricane, there's a different proposition, which is to invite you to sit back and maybe decenter yourself and occupy the position of listener. And then the last thing I just wanted to note was that you mentioned that we don't use experts in the film. That was a very, very deliberate choice. I was thinking a lot about a film called Life in Debt by Stephanie Black from 2001, I believe. And that's a film about Jamaica and the IMF and a lot of things. But one of the things that film does, which I sort of stole from that film, was that, you learn about these very like esoteric things like the IMF and the World Bank by spending time with farmers who are dumping out gallons and gallons of milk because the price of milk has been dropped so low. It's a whole complicated thing, but you have this experiential relationship because you're seeing, sorry, my dog, my dog is showing me.
Hey. It's all good. Hello, baby.
Hold on a second. Come here.
Get her to be part of the Zoom. She wants to be.
Yeah, come here. You want to say that? She's just sitting down. Okay. Anyway, sorry. I what I meant to say is that
it's all good. I have one.
Oh, good. Here, come on. Hop up. You want to hop up? Say hi. There she is.
Oh, there it is. Oh, so beautiful. Hello. Sorry.
Anyway, what I was saying is that I believe that people in Puerto Rico are crisis experts. We don't need somebody with a PhD or a politician who's elected. Precisely, in a lot of ways, the leadership in Puerto Rico has failed so profoundly that the last thing we need is that kind of quote unquote expertise. Mm-hmm. What we need is to acknowledge the collective power and vitality and knowledge of people living the crisis. And I think, in this moment that we all find ourselves in this pandemic time, I think there's a lot that we all could say about what it is to live in crisis. And so anyway, that was just a real principle that we tried to adhere to, was not to, have this sort of top-down approach of like a hierarchy of who's allowed to speak.
And I think that works so beautifully too, when you invite us into the table of this group of friends, and then it becomes a very hopeful film. And it does almost the opposite of what every film about disaster does, because it brings us to building community and family and joy and like cooking for each other and like dreaming a better future, but also like being connected to our past and being very well aware of it, but not hanging on to that and just kind of like imagining that things can be changed. And in fact, what we see in the film is that they did change. So I think it's a very, I think, I know you and I have talked about your film before, and then like COVID-19 hit when you were, ready to do your world premiere in person. But I think the dimension of this film has even been expanded, because of what we're going through in a world pandemic. And there is so many different aspects that we can identify with and that we can, learn from in the way that people are self-organizing and taking care of each other, after Maria.
Yeah. And I think this is, again, what the mainstream media was not talking about. They were, I have heard since COVID began, the phrase mutual aid talked about in the United States, actually with the increasing regularity. It's like, it's a concept people are becoming familiar with. Before, people weren't talking about it in a wide way in the US and in Puerto Rico. The untold story in terms of the wider world is one of mutual aid. It's one of people actually coming together and caring for one another and in the complete and utter abandonment by institutional powers that be, whether it's governments, NGOs, et cetera. Like, it really was people helping other people that saved lives after the hurricane. And the other thing I would say is that when we were first editing the film, we thought we were almost done before the protests erupted. And it was funny because in the previous cuts of the film before the protests, people would say, this is not a very hopeful film. And the protests really, I think, they were the kind of catharsis of all of those 2 years of pent up anger and grief and lack of resolution. But they are really instructive, because in 12 days, it was, peaceful protests that resulted in the removal of a corrupt governor in 12 days of protests. And I think that we are living right now in a moment where, so much feels so overwhelming and frightening. And yet I think that, communities that live in crisis understand that community care is the center of everything. And I think we're finding that, it's interesting because I think almost like it's for those societies that are sort of isolated and sequestered from one another, that COVID is suddenly, it's like, I think that cultures where, community solidarity is already part of the fabric, it's a little different experience. And I think the United States is, as this kind of hyper-capitalist place where everyone's kind of out for themselves, we're learning about the value in coming together and frankly, I think we could learn something from the amount of accountability that people in Puerto Rico have demanded from their leadership. And anyway, there's a lot more I can say about it, but I've been saying since I began the film that Puerto Rico is like a handbook for our world, for our contemporary moment. And that was before COVID. But I really believe this is part of what the film can do is invite, those of you that have never been to Puerto Rico to contemplate it, because it can help you to understand the day to day.
Absolutely. Just go visit and hang out, but don't be a gentrifier or a creepo.
Yeah, I think this is part of it too, is, the film tries to sort of subvert that tourist kind of gaze that, I think a lot of folks historically have gone to Puerto Rico and it's sort of there for them. And this is a film that invites people to come and visit, but in a position of listening. And I think that that's something that we tried to sort of model in the structure of the film. So by all means, it's not to say that you're not invited, but you're invited to learn something.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think this is all the time we have, but it's been a great pleasure to have you and your film with us.
Thank you. It was really beautiful to talk with you, Ruth. Thank you.